HHDL and welcome to In Conversation with Tibet TV. This is Sakina Bhatt. For today's episode, I have a former civil servant who was a former secretary of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He was also the former representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to Europe, and he was a former envoy of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to negotiate with China. His name is Kalsang Gyaltsen. Kalsang Gyaltsen, welcome to our show. So, Kalsang Gyaltsen, most of the Tibetans know that you were one of the two former envoys of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So, and also you have served in CTA for a very long time. So, tell us something about yourself.
I was sent at a very early age. I was 11, 12 years old in a group of 10 children for education to Switzerland. So I grew up in Switzerland. And then in 1970, I joined with other Tibetans young Tibetans living in Europe to found the Europe Tibetan Youth Association. So with my colleagues from the Europe Tibetan Youth Association, we started to take part in the Tibetan freedom movement. And in late 83, I came to Dharamsala and to serve for 1 year as a volunteer in Ganji Kishong. At that time, it is called the Tibetan government in exile. So I volunteered to serve for one year. So at the end of 1984, I was asked by the Kashak and also advised by His Holiness Dalai Lama to join the service. So I was made an assistant to the representative of His Holiness Dalai Lama in the office of Tibet in Switzerland. So I joined that office in 1985, beginning of 1985. And I worked for the CTA until my retirement in 2016, in July. So that's, briefly speaking, the stages of my service within the CTA.
So you just mentioned that earlier you were sent to Switzerland for your education. So were you among the first Tibetans to get educated?
Yes, at that time, because the circumstances here in India in 1959 and in the early 60s were very, very harsh, because there were no one, no exile government who could, which functioned properly and could take care of all the refugees coming out of Tibet. In 1959, His Holiness has first to set up this administration. So therefore, because there was no preparation for the flood of Tibetan refugees coming from Tibet, and because of the difficult circumstances, many died, especially young and the elderly people, from exhaustion, from sickness, and so on. So His Holiness appealed to the international community for help. So different countries took up Tibetan refugees, especially young Tibetans, for education. Among them, also Switzerland.
Okay. You just said that earlier when you were here in 1985, Central Tibetan administration was a part of Gande Putang. That was then. So now, since 2011, when His Holiness withdrew his political power and Sikyong became the political leader, this administration came to be known as Central Tibetan Administration in Tibetan. So how do you see the workings of CTA post the era of Gande Putang?
No, first of all, Central Tibetan Administration, it used to be called the Central Tibetan Administration in English, also at that time. The Tibetan translation or Tibetan name was Tibetan government in exile. So that's one thing. The second difference, I think, today the facilities are much, much better than back in 85. And For example, when I started in 1983 as a volunteer, I was placed in the information department. So among maybe 15 people, we had maybe 3 or 4 typewriters. So we had to share 3 or 4 typewriters among all the people, you know.
Okay. Nobody had their personal typewriters?
No, only a few people, you know, maybe the secretary and so on. So therefore, the facilities are today much better, and the living conditions are much better. Food in the staff mess was very, very poor at that time, you know. So besides that, I think the other difference is also when I look back, we were all young Tibetans in the service of the CTA, and actually, even after the office hours, we were together. We were always discussing, you know, about Tibet, Tibetan freedom struggle, and it's all, our whole life resolved around the Tibetan freedom struggle. So, in that respect, I think, you know, the people, the young people working in the CTA were much more politically minded and politically conscious.
There were many youngsters back then, during your time working here at CTA?
Yes, many, you know, young Tibetans who came out of colleges in India. Many of them joined the service, and so, but still, you know, and at that time, you know, I think for most young, educated Tibetans working in the service of the Central Tibet administration was one of their top foremost wish and also, you know, ambition. It has many reasons for it. Of course, the other reason is young Tibetans who were educated in India had difficulties to find other places of employment, you know, in India. But nevertheless, I think most of them joined the service of the Central Tibetan administration because they want to serve His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and they want to play a significant role in the movement of the for Tibetan freedom. So that was their the driving motivation for most of the people joining the service. And then I think also today's staff or civil servants, the younger one, they are much better educated than you know, the people who were serving at that time in the CTA, and many of the young people now working in the CTA have a much better and broader understanding of the world, of international politics, and so on. There are big differences, but I think what we can be proud of, and especially thanks to the leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, you know, the past 8 years have demonstrated clearly and shown that we Tibetans have managed the transition of the leadership from an older generation to a younger generation. That means that this administration, this Central Tibetan administration will last for another few generations, So I think we have laid a sound ground for the future survival and activities of the Central Tibetan administration, if there should be the need that we have to continue to live in exile.
So you have served for more than 30 years as a civil servant, and we all know that you and the special envoy Gary Gyaltsen led 9 rounds of formal discussion and 1 informal discussion. So looking back, how do you see this journey?
The policy of the Chinese government obviously did not change in any significant way, Chinese government policy with regard to Tibet continues to be very hardline and very intransigent. But on the other hand, I think, that we have been able to resume the dialogue in 2002 and keep up the dialogue till 2010. This clearly demonstrates that if we make sufficient efforts and if we are politically, diplomatically skilled enough in mobilizing the international community, that it is possible, that we can come up with that it is possible to bring the Chinese to the negotiation table. So, in 2002 and now, the situation are not that much, the political situation is not of that much different, China in 2002 was a big power and economically, developing very fast and becoming more and more important in the international community. Despite all these factors, somehow the Chinese leadership felt the need to resume the dialogue with the Tibetans, because many governments were urging the Chinese government, to talk to the Tibetans. And we have been able to pull the right strings, to press the Chinese government to resume dialogue. So I think since the situation is not much different, the fundamental factors are not much different, I think it should be also possible now for us to, if we make sufficient effort and if we have the right approach, that we can resume the dialogue again,
Okay, so although you resigned from your task representing His Holiness as envoy in the Sino-Tibetan dialogue process, you continue to serve His Holiness being his representative to Europe. So how does this role entail?
My role as a special representative of His Holiness in Europe was mostly keeping in touch with different governments in Europe, and especially with the European Union. Many Tibetans don't realize that, for example, if we speak of American support for Tibet, the fact is, in America, you have only one government, one Congress, one Senate, and one State Department that you have to lobby. If you lobby in Europe for Tibet, that means within the European Union, there are 28 different governments, 28 different foreign ministries, and different languages. So, therefore, the political work in Europe is much more difficult in terms of, different languages, numbers of government and numbers of the counterpart that you have to deal with. And then also I think Europe is a very, very important, continent, because, Western, when we Tibetans seek international help, then we seek from different governments support and help based on their commitment to human rights principles. And Europe is the country where the concept of human rights were, first born with the French Revolution and so on. So therefore, the concept of human rights is very much embedded in European culture. And as such, the human rights are, for most European governments, a very important element of their foreign relations and foreign policy. So therefore, we have a very strong basis in Europe to lobby European government for support for restoring human rights in Tibet. So as a result, many European governments are sympathetic to the Tibetan cause, and then also, because of the many visits of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to Europe, there is a tremendous respect and admiration and appreciation of His Holiness, thinking his message among European countries. In many polls, it has become very clear that European people consider His Holiness the Dalai Lama as one of the most important religious and moral leaders of our contemporary time.
So finally, as someone who has served here for a very long time, for almost 30 years, do you have any advice for the youngsters who are a staff of CTA?
Yes, because I feel, in every nation, and especially in every freedom movement, the youth of our people have played a very vital role in the freedom struggle of many different nations and people. So similarly, I think the Tibetan youth need also to play that role. And I think, as a young Tibetan, I don't expect from the young Tibetans that they don't make any mistakes. I don't expect from the young Tibetans that they are, diplomatic and experienced. What I expect from the young Tibetans is that they don't lack in dedication to the Tibetan cause, sincerity for the Tibetan cause, and determination for the Tibetan. That are, essential aspects of a politically minded young Tibetans that we need today. So that one thing. Second thing is, many people nowadays think, China is too powerful and we are weak and there is nothing we can do much. That's totally wrong, totally wrong. Look now at around the world. So much change is taking place at the present in the international community and in the international setup. And And also, China, although it looks to the outside world, China is very big, very powerful, and so on. But under the surface, China faces major problems, very serious problems. And there are, within China, among the Chinese elite, there are different views that many are very critical of the present policies of Chinese government and Chinese leadership. And thanks to the efforts of His Holiness Dalai Lama, many young Chinese are showing sympathy to the Tibetan cause and have understanding for the aspirations of the Tibetan people. So even in the international community in Europe where I live, within 2-3 years, Europe's perception of China has changed dramatically. Now Europe considers China as a threat. So all the European government and European Union is, China has become a top issue of concern. So therefore, all these changes offer also to the Tibetans new chances, new possibilities. So it's very clear that the last chapter of the Tibetan freedom movement is yet to be written. So there is every reason for young Tibetans to really, participate in the Tibetan freedom movement and to make a difference, You, the younger generation, you can write history, make history for the Tibetan people, That's my message to the young Tibetans.
Thank you so much for your wonderful words, Kalsang Gyaltsen, and thank you for speaking to Tibettv.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next episode of In Conversation with Tibettv.